Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Teaming with Possibility. My name is Simon Dowling, and this is the podcast where we explore all of the possibilities, all of the ins, the outs, the highs and the lows of teams and making teams work. Hey, it's December 2022, which means, drum roll, sleigh bells, and the rest of it, we are coming rapidly towards the end of the year, and in particular to the festive season. Festive for many of us, and I don't know what you have planned, but for a lot of teams that feels like a sprint to the finish line. Maybe there's that feeling. Someone asked me yesterday, are we ramping up or am I ramping down for the end of the year? And I think still at the point of accelerating, which is interesting as an observation. Like, this is the point. I think we're accelerating in order to make it a great finish. I feel like there's all sorts of things that I want to have in place before I pull down the shutters for the year. Because here particularly, I'm not going to make any comparison because I don't know, but definitely in Australia, there is a tendency, perhaps because it's summer, come whether it's Christmas Eve, 23rd, 22nd, whatever the date might be, we just sort of don our board shorts and head down to the beach for summer. And many people would say things don't really get going again in Australia until after Australia Day, which is a public holiday that falls on the 26th of January, which I think next year is a Thursday. So things don't really get going until once we've hit that date, which is always an interesting observation. Anyhow, I definitely am looking forward to a break. But it made me think, what is the purpose of this episode today? And I thought today's conversation could be a little bit of a reflection on what has stood out for me over the course of my work with teams over 2022. And as a result, bringing it into the festive theme, what are my wishes for teams in 2023? In fact, let's call it 3 wishes. Let's try and narrow this down. What are my 3 wishes for teams in 2023? And then we can wrap it up in a bow. By the way, before I get into that, big thank you for joining me. I can't believe we're up to episode 4. This is what I called at episode 1 the pre-season edition, because I have created a few episodes in the lead up to the end of the year, with then the plan to come back and launch more fully mid-January. So I don't know what launch more fully means, but this has been fun. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for being on the ride. And I'm looking forward to doing a lot more of this sort of thing in 2023. So what have I really been noticing, and therefore what are my 3 wishes for teams in 2023? Okay, let's do this. I reckon one of them would have to be that teams should hold space for one another. My wish for teams is that they are able to hold a space for themselves as a team. And what do I mean by that? It is really easy in the hustle and bustle, the hurly-burly of everyday work, for everyone in our team to just be busy. And I certainly know this is true for us. In the context of the theme of this program, we've just expanded the size of our team at Simon Dowling Global Enterprises, and we now have a 4th person on board. And that definitely changes the way you think about not just everyone's tasks, like what are you busy on, but how now and when do we hold a space for us to be a team in the true sense. Now, there's different ways you can hold space for a team, or a team can hold space for itself. One of which is the work itself can sometimes be that space. Like if I think of my basketball team that I coach, bunch of under 14s, one of the spaces for them to be a team is on the court on game day, because that is when they play very much as a team. So their work demands them to play as a team. The other time, of course, where we hold space for ourselves as a team is on training day, Tuesday nights, We've got 45 minutes together. Not a heck of a lot of time, but that 45 minutes is not just an opportunity to practice skills. It's kind of also an opportunity to connect, to kind of just hang with each other, to get to know one another better, to understand and have some fun together. In fact, that's something I have to constantly remind myself as a coach is, 45 minutes, time's scarce, we've got to get in and do the drills, we've got to build the skills. But I have to also bear in mind that this is really precious time for the team to enjoy each other's company and kind of deepen their connection with each other. And that's particularly important if they haven't had a good match the weekend before. Like if they've had a loss, we've got to kind of make sure training time is also a time to rekindle the sense of fun with each other, the sense of enjoyment of being part of this team. So if I think of that in the context of the sporting environment, that basketball team, I can also think of that as an example in the days when I performed improvised theatre. Show night was definitely a time where we would hold space for ourselves as a team. And in fact, we'd expand that space by often having a drink together beforehand or going out for a drink or a meal afterwards or a bit of both. Because the whole time of performing and creating a show on a stage for an audience was kind of, that was the point, but it wasn't the point. It was also simply the context where we could all work together, spend time together, build some strong relationships along the way. So show night, as well as training night, Monday nights, which I still remember clearly, were a great chance to come together, have a laugh again, maybe go for a drink afterwards, whatever. But you were practicing the skills as well as connecting. And I wonder, if you sort of sit with me then on this theme, I wonder whether teams in the corporate environment, the business world, actually just don't have enough of that space, because the work for a lot of teams does not always require us as a whole to be bouncing off each other. Often the work involves us taking our piece of the puzzle, our piece of the work, our task, our element, and getting into our swim lane and doing that work, and then coming back together to report on how it's been done. So that could either be done individually or it might be done in, pairs or little almost silos. But in that environment, the work's not like game day. In other words, it's not bringing us all together. It's not the space for us to be a team in the true sense as a whole. Now, that's not always true. There's plenty of perhaps teams where the work is much more team-based. And so in that space, there might be more of that opportunity to riff off each other. I tell you what, leadership teams are a great example of this. I often ask leadership teams the question, do you actually have anything to do? And they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, of course we've got plenty to do. It's like, do you as a team have anything to do? I know that you as individual leaders and the teams that report to you have heaps to do, but do you actually have, as a team, something to do together? To be on a task, on a project, on an idea, on something together, which then creates a space for you to team. And it's quite amazing how often the answer to that question comes up, actually, no, we don't. There is nothing we actually do together other than report and to talk about the progress of our individual work. So having a space where you can work together is a great space to start with. But in the absence of that, or maybe that's actually the challenge, is to create that. But in the absence of having the work as your space, we have to think, I think, teams, of other ways. How do we hold space for ourselves to be a team? Now, a lot of the work that I do, for example, if I think of what are those spaces, a lot of the work I do is facilitating retreats, offsites, team days, where someone along the line has decided we should create a space for us. But the problem with that, and they're invaluable, right, those opportunities, but the problem with that is that they are too infrequent. So more often than not, I will come in and work with that team for 1 day, maybe 2 days, but that might be it for the year in terms of their space where they can simply talk and reflect on how they are going as a team, where they want their energy to be over the next 12 months, what are their kind of ways of working, How can they better understand and learn something about each other? All those beautiful conversations are, in fact, if you put the conversations aside, they're all just the product of by creating that space for the team to sit together and have the conversations that just need to be had. Often we'll sort of talk about this as part of my role. We spend a lot of time maybe designing and crafting agendas and how we're going to approach certain conversations. But actually, really what the most important part of all of this is how do we make sure there is space for the conversations that need to be had, that are waiting to be had by this team. And sometimes they'll emerge just by being in the space. They might be conversations about a particular kind of project or a piece of work that created friction between the team, and people want to debrief why that is. Or perhaps it will be a conversation about feeling like the way in which they're using their meeting times as a team sucks, and that has to be fixed. But if we don't create and hold the space for those conversations to emerge, chances are they will kind of fester, continue to cause friction, and potentially bubble up as frustration, as gripes, as people kind of complaining to one another about each other. And believe you me, I have seen way too many of those examples this year. And I think, by the way, that is in part because it's almost a hangover of COVID. The pandemic forced teams to, physically separate themselves from each other in most cases. And the outcome of that is that you had teams sitting in their boxes at their computers on Zoom meetings or on whatever platform for their video calls, simply doing the work in Slack channels, doing the transactional stuff. But then, because of that separation, not creating enough time to simply say, how are we going? How are we going? What do we want for ourselves? How do we shape that? How do we design that? What are we learning about ourselves? What haven't we been talking about that we should be? All of those much more organic kind of conversations, but are incredibly important to shape the dynamic of our team. So I think that's what I mean by holding space for ourselves. So my wish for teams is that they prioritize that. A lot of teams like to use the language of what's our cadence of team-focused conversations. The cadence of coming together to simply reflect on how we're going, how do we want to, what are we learning, what do we want to develop? Just those conversations. And as a minimum, my wish for teams is that they be doing that every 90 days. Every 90 days, a team should be coming together and carving out some proper time, not 10 minutes at the beginning of a meeting, some proper time to talk about how are we doing. And as part of that, breaking bread together, metaphorically, if not literally. Maybe you do have some post-pandemic sourdough bakers in your midst and they should be baking bread. But, having a meal together, sharing some time together. And if your team is remote and cannot come together physically every 90 days, because that's not feasible or it's too expensive because people would have to travel, then creating a virtual space to do that. It is possible. You've just got to design it differently from your normal meeting. Okay, so that's holding space, which probably leads me to the second of my wishes. And the second of my wishes is connection. My wish for teams in 2023 is that they deepen their connectedness. That's a funny way to say that word. I was trying to be emphatic. Their connectedness to one another. And a whole bunch of kind of random relationships. If you look at most teams, it's a wonder that they thrive, given that often these relationships are kind of spliced together, made up of people who were introduced to the team without the rest of the team necessarily choosing that person to join us, without often us making really conscious choices to say, this is the group of 8 people. This is the group of 10 people. This is the group of 20 people that I want to spend the rest of my days with. And it's a lot of hours. So simply throwing them together into an environment and saying, here's the work, doesn't necessarily allow teams to build the kind of connection and sense of belonging to each other as a tribe, because that's what really a team is. It's kind of a community. If you don't like that word tribe, it's this kind of space where we're a group of people who say, every one of us is welcome to be here, and I choose to play with you. How do we get a team to that place? Well, it comes down to connection. And connection, some people would say, oh, well, we have Friday night drinks. We have cocktail hour. We have lunch once a week. And they're fantastic because they're a space, going back to our first wish, a space where teams can kind of get to know each other better without focusing on the work. But of course, connectedness also can come from, again, conversations that I think most teams are skipping over. And this comes back to perhaps an observation from the last year or so, is that teams just aren't spending enough time talking about things like, who are you? Where do you come from? What's your work history till now? What drives you in the work that you do? What motivates you? What floats your boat? What pisses you off? What triggers you? What are the environments where you perform to your best? What are the environments where you're hindered from bringing out your best? All of those sorts of questions. I'm not, I'm obviously riffing here without providing an instruction set, but teams need to prioritize time to talk about those things. There's a whole bunch of ways you can go about that. I mean, the first is just to have these kinds of, just choose a group of questions and ask the team each to talk about it, share their perspectives with each other. You can go one step further and do some kind of profiling first that leads people or inspires people to have some self-awareness in that conversation. So that could be your Myers-Briggs or your DISC profile or your Herman Brain or whatever those sorts of personality profiling tools are. I'm not a believer that they give you your truth, because they don't. But they certainly help give you, they give a team a shared language to talk about themselves with each other. There's one actually online that I came across recently, and I'll try and drop the link in the show notes. It's called the Sparketype. And the Sparketype is this notion of, what lights you up, and it gives you a report and a profile based on that. And it's again a nice way for a team to talk about what sort of person each of them feels that they are. But then, of course, that awareness has to build into another conversation, which is, well, how do we connect all that? Like, where's the opportunities there? Like, are there opportunities for us to involve different people on different things? Are there opportunities for us to help one another? So a great question I love to get teams talking about with each other is, how can each of you help me with the things I feel most challenged by? So what is it that challenges me, or what is it that I find most challenging in this teaming environment, and how can you help me with that? So, it might be I'm challenged by, or I find it hard to voice a differing opinion when there's a kind of energized conversation happening. How do I voice up in that environment? You can help me with that. If you notice I'm quiet, you could, just say, hey, Simon, I'm wondering what you're thinking. That sort of thing. So connectedness is about getting to know one another better for who you are, and in particular what you bring to the table. Of course, and one tool that's really, I think, proving valuable to a lot of the clients I'm working with at the moment is the Gallup Strengths Finder. So it's a classic Gallup Strengths Finder, Clifton Strengths Finder. But it's a nice way, again, to just help people map and have a language for understanding what their individual or their unique strengths are, and therefore their unique contribution to the team. I think the more you do that, the more you discover the opportunity for value exchange between us as a group, but also a strong sense of, oh, cool, we're all part of something together. That brings me to my third and final wish for teams. And this one, I guess, kind of a simple one, I guess. And it's just that teams realize that the ability to get everybody speaking up and sharing a perspective is absolutely essential if they want to harness the strength in that team. And the strength is difference and diversity. If you've got people in a team with different ideas, different opinions, different backgrounds, different training, different worldviews, different whatever, the only way we are going to harness that is to make sure everyone is contributing to conversation. And that, I think, starts with a mindset of curiosity. Because it could start with just a principle of inclusion, which is great, but it could be very easy for inclusion to feel like, oh, that's something we should do, as opposed to why though? What's our purpose for wanting to include all these different voices? And I think it has to come from a place of curiosity. Aren't we curious to know what Simon's thinking in this conversation, given he hasn't voiced point of view yet? So it's not let's include Simon just to be polite or because he's an introvert and it's always a good idea to ask the introverts for their point of view. Let's not just do it for that reason. Let's do it because we are genuinely curious to know, what are we not thinking about in this conversation right now? What are we missing? How do others around here see this differently from the majority view? So for teams, I far too often, I guess, just see teams where 3 or 4 people, maybe less, are happy to do all the talking. They're happy to dominate the conversation. And when I say happy to, it's not because they love the sound of their own voice. It's because it's easy. In other words, so long as there's someone else talking, I feel like there's conversation happening. And it's easier for me to keep talking and for us to keep talking than to sit there with awkward silence. It's easier to keep talking than to put anyone in an awkward situation of being asked what they think in front of everybody. Is that okay to do that? It absolutely is okay to do that. But what we need to shift away from is that that's not, like, you're bringing your own baggage to that. That's not the school teacher or the lecturer at university singling you out in the lecture theatre and saying, please, what's your view? You're being assessed. But it's a different one, which is, it's a different tone, which is, I don't want to continue until I know what's in people's heads because I'm curious what I might be missing. So my wish for your team is that you evolve into this place and work hard and talk about the need for this place of who are we curious to hear from? And if there's one simple way to do that, it's with that question. Who are we curious to hear from? Or if I'm sitting in a group or a team conversation and you're doing all the talking, I might at the end of that say, I love that point of view. You know, what I'm learning from that is X, Y, and Z. I want to know, who are you curious to hear from in this conversation? To know what they're thinking about this. In other words, the confident speaker now needs to be kind of prodded into being the curious inquirer, the curious listener. How cool would that be? So maybe that's a little device you can use straight away, which is, who are you or who are we curious to hear from in this conversation? Heck, sometimes that might lead you to go, I'm curious to hear from people who aren't even in this room. I'm curious to hear from the customer. I'm curious to hear from someone in our product team. I'm curious to hear from one of our shareholders or one of the board members or whatever it might be. Get curious. So that's my wish for you as a team. So 3 wishes. We started with I'm reflecting on the year that's just been, the work I've been doing with different teams, and what does that mean in terms of what I wish for in terms of teams. I set myself a little challenge of coming up with 3. So what do we talk about? We said, firstly, holding space. So teams that hold space for themselves to team. to reflect on the kind of team they are, to connect as people, to design, if you like, and learn what it means for them to be the best possible team, the kind of team they want to be, even maybe to craft a vision of what that is in the first place. So that's the holding space. And then connected to that was the second wish, which is connectedness. My wish for teams that they spend time deepening that sense of connection to one another, understanding of each other, but also that, and as a result, that sense of belonging, that we are a group of human beings with rich relationships between us, which in turn builds the trust and the psychological safety we're going to need to do the work we want to do. And then the third and last wish was, what was it? Oh, yes. So, multiple voices speaking up. So the voicing up, the hearing multiple perspectives. So are we curious? Maybe the wish there is curiosity to learn from one another. Are we curious enough to know, well, if we're part of this team together, I really want to know what each person could bring to this moment right now. It's a little bit like, if I can go back to the basketball metaphor, because this just came to mind, it's a little bit like the boy on the team who won't pass to others, just the people he knows, because that feels easy to trust. And I say he in this case because it is a bunch of boys. The player he knows, as opposed to being curious, what would happen if I pass it to this other player over here? So my job as a coach is to kind of foster that curiosity as well. Right, there you have it. 3 wishes for you and your teams in 2023. Hey, I'm going to see you on the other side of the holiday break. Our next episode will drop on, I'll look up that date while I'm talking to you. But the other thing I'd say is don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to know, what are the questions or the themes you would love me to riff on around teaming with possibility. And the way you can do that is you can send me an email to podcast@simondowling.com.au, podcast@simondowling.com.au. I will read all of those emails. I will respond to them where I can. And I would love to get your feedback, your inspiration, your requests, because I am fundamentally creating this podcast for you, to be useful, to serve you as best as I can, to help you make your team, get your team to the place of being the best possible team it can. That's it from me. I shall see you next time. Bye for now. Take care.